Okay, hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming here this evening for this talk, The Exciting Journey from Scientist to Entrepreneur. It's really a pleasure for us to have Serguei Beloussov here to address you. So Serguei is going to talk about his journey, so I'm not going to tell you that much about it. He's a businessman and entrepreneur who's been working in technology for 2 decades, starting and leading a string of successful companies. Let me mention only the business that his current focus, Acronis. You may notice it has a presence here tonight. So as well as running businesses, Serguei is an investor, a partner in venture capital firms. He's also co-authored over 200 patents, with more than 80 of them issued. So some of you might be wondering why we're hosting this talk here at the Center for Quantum Technologies. So one of the interesting things about Serguei is that he started in science. He was a physics student in Moscow. Not only that, but he continues to have an enthusiasm and passion for physics. So he is a member of our governing board here and also on the chair of the board of trustees of the Russian Quantum Center. And through his Q-Wave venture capital fund, he's investing in businesses that seek to commercialize advanced quantum technologies. So I hope this talk will be an interesting perspective on business and innovation, particularly here for Singapore, where so much is invested in research and innovation. So I'm going to hand over to Serguei because he will tell his story best.
Okay. I think I have a microphone. Hello, everybody. It's a bit awkward for me to talk about myself, so I hope it will be interesting enough. This talk started from the point when I was accidentally invited to be chairman of the board of one of the top Russian universities, Novosibirsk State University, based in Novosibirsk. And they, as a part of inviting me, they wanted me to present to the students there something about business. And you know, Novosibirsk, who of you know where is Novosibirsk? Yeah, some people. Who are from Novosibirsk? Yeah, you see, there are people from Novosibirsk, but they work for Acronis. And so it's in the middle of Russia, just 1 hour time zone difference. And it's actually, at the moment, from the standpoint of rating, number 3 university in Russia. But it's a technology school, and it's a relatively small school. And so there, they asked me to give a talk on a very weird topic, how to make $1 billion. And this is quite often that if you are involved in business for a while, you get to be asked this kind of a stupid question. And of course, there is no algorithm how to make $1 billion. And you know, perhaps instead of trying to give them an algorithm how to make $1 billion, I decided that I will just tell my story, and maybe there are some things about my story which will help the students to be more successful where they want to be more successful. Before we proceed, I just want to ask, how many of you guys are from CQT? Okay. How many are from NUS? Okay, good. How many are not from CQT and not from NUS? No? How many are in business? Novosibirsk guys, you are in business? Okay, so mostly scientists. How many of you are planning to be in business at some point? Okay, there are some people. Okay, well, it just happened because I was born, raised, and educated in Russia. I'm a Singapore citizen right now, surprisingly. And you know, just at some point recently, I was in some Russian-Singapore business forum, and the British-based host was telling the people that they, you know, what they should say and not say. And there was sort of 4 Russian-looking people like me, and 1 very much Chinese-looking person from Philippines, apparently. But they would say like, okay, so you say this, and I said, I'm Singaporean. And the guy said like, well, I look much more Singaporean than you, but I'm actually from Philippines and I'm Chinese. Right. So I was graduated from Moscow Institute of Physics and Technology, which at the point when I was entering the school in 1988 was a top university of Soviet Union for physics and technology. At least it seems that way to me. I got Bachelor of Science, Master of Science in Physics in the school. And then I founded a bunch of companies. I just want to point out, unfortunately, if you watch the movie about Social Network, who watched this movie? So remember there was this Sean Parker who was explaining to Mark Zuckerberg that it's much better to catch a marlin than to fish for trout. And unfortunately, I'm more or less fish for trout because I built probably 5 companies with over $100 million in revenue and with hundreds of millions or potentially billions of market cap, which is a reasonable result, but there's a lot of companies in different industries. The first one I started while still in school. It became one of the largest retailers and PC manufacturers in Russia at some point with almost $1 billion in revenue, but I wasn't involved at that point. I left it when it was about 150 million. The second one was actually, and it was manufacturer of PCs. That's a company which brought me to Singapore. I came to Singapore for the first time in January 1994 to open a purchase office of the company. And then I started the company myself, and after that, all the companies I've started, which is called Rolson. It's still in operation. At some point, it was about $500 million in revenue, slightly smaller now, very profitable. Makes all kinds of consumer electronics. Sounds very conventional, but when you do it in Russia, you have to do R&D. Then Solomon Software, this was here. I was actually in charge of international operations of Rolson, and purchasing and coordination was a CEO. I was sort of bored, and I started the company Solomon Software Southeast Asia, which makes accounting software for mid-sized businesses, distributes and then makes them. And then I became a founder and CEO of SWSoft, which split in 2 companies, multi-$100 million Parallels. Any of you use Parallels? Oh, you see, you use Parallels. That's good. And Acronis, I wasn't involved with Acronis for a long time, and I stopped being involved with Parallels officially in 2011, but really I hired my replacement in 2010. And then for several years, I was involved in venture capital business. I'm still a partner in Runa Capital, which is focused on software-related companies, so internet services or software itself. QF Capital, which is involved with companies which do material science, and Fistech Ventures, which is an early-stage university fund. Well, started, of course, at Fistech. That's other name of my alma mater, Moscow Institute of Physics and Technology, but it spreads across multiple schools right now, and we will have an office of all of these funds here, and we're looking constantly for projects in all areas. Altogether, they are approximately several hundred million, let's say, going forward, around $400 million. And they invest in different stages, and they invest in both material science and information technology companies with some deep technology expertise. And along the way, because of, I guess, my various bad qualities, I was involved in a lot of different businesses. Westcom, Filecon, Western Computer and Peripherals. That one even had office in Pakistan, and in Malaysia and Indonesia as Linux, and for Telesystem, Acumatic, Cruzonix, and much more. Then at some point, about 5 years ago, my classmates who did not pursue business career, but continued to pursue a scientific career, Eugene Demler, who is professor at Harvard, and Misha Lukin, Eugene was even my roommate, they somehow convinced me that it's cool to start quantum centers. And then Mark Shmulevich, who is also here, Mark, where are you? Is over there. He was introduced to me by one of the postdocs of Misha, and I visited this center. I think it was in 2009 or 2010. And your charismatic, in his own way, leader, Artur, convinced me to also start being here. Well, you remember that, how I visited that time. Remember, we came to see you, actually. And so I got involved with the Russian Quantum Center, which is very similar to yours, but there's only 10 PIs right now. So it's about 2.5 times smaller. Not enough critical mass, I suppose. And then Artur invited me to the governing board of Singapore Quantum Center to help you be more business-like. I'm not sure that we accomplished that much success yet, but I hope there will be more applied results from the center. And then, as I became a world expert on starting Russian quantum centers, all of a sudden, of course I'm not, but that's a strange perception. I was invited to be participating in several universities in Russia, and so I'm sort of, my hobby is to be involved in scientific projects and to help these projects to commercialize the results of their work and to, more importantly, unfortunately, less interestingly, but more importantly, raise capital. But then the life is unpredictable, so I had to go back, and in about 1.5 years ago, I went back to manage Acronis, which is again, multi-$100 million company which makes backup, disaster recovery, and secure access. Any of you guys use Acronis? Come on, you use Acronis. Right, so there are some Acronis people here. I'll talk about Acronis a little bit. So now, when I was talking to students, and of course you guys are not students, some of you are students. How many of you are students? Okay, well, good number of students. I was trying to talk about what in my experience helped me being a physicist by education. And many times in my life, up until maybe 5-7 years ago, when my businesses became very valuable and significant, I was listening about the fact that I'm a scientist and engineer and not a business person to start businesses. So first of all, I was born in St. Petersburg in 1971. How many of you been to St. Petersburg? Well, it's a very nice city. This is one of the nicest buildings in the world, Isaac Cathedral. I actually think it's probably, well, it's definitely one of the nicest buildings in the world. It was built by French architect about 200 years ago. And here is a Hermitage, which is one of the largest museums in the world. I think it's number 10 in popularity in terms of number of visitors, but it's, I think, number 3 or number 2 in terms of number of exhibits. That's me. It's my mom, actually. From the very early age, my parents were professors. Well, they were physicists, not always professors. They were just not having enough money, and so instead of bringing me to kindergarten, they would often bring me to the lab. And this is St. Petersburg State University. So I was in the lab. Well, one of the first things I remember being in the lab, either of my mom or my dad, because of one or another reason. And then it moved to a city nearby Moscow, to some academic city nearby St. Petersburg. So this is still a university. And it just happens that that city, while being a scientific city, was also very much a cultural center. It's called Peterhof. Any of you been to Peterhof? Okay, some people been. It's very beautiful. And it basically was built by Russian Tsar Peter the Great, and he tried to be cooler than Versailles. How many of you been to Versailles in France? Okay, so it's sort of cooler, but more interestingly, Russian Tsars, just like me, were not particularly very focused, and so each one of them would try to build a new palace there. And so right around that city, there are probably, well, I guess there were 10 palaces of different Tsars, but right now, after the war, 5 of them stayed. And my school was just next to that palace, just basically, literally 50, 100 meters away. And so I was growing up while actually looking at all of that very nice things, which was quite different from the rest of Soviet Union at that time. And, that's me again, not so interesting. When I was a kid, that's another thing. So I think it was important for me to be exposed to art. I think reality is that, I used to talk about the fact that the one thing which people don't understand is how important for the world is science. People don't understand it. They think other things are important, like sport, for example. People would pay. I was present at a talk of 2 very wealthy people. I was asking for $30 million donation into Russian Quantum Center. And they talked to me like, why to give money to Russian Quantum Center? We don't want to, 30 million, maybe 10 million. And then they said, okay, so we discussed that, so we may give the money. And then they started discussing about buying Lionel Messi. And Lionel Messi was 290 million euro. But they were thinking it's much more cool to buy Lionel Messi for 290 million euros than donate money to science. But reality is that besides science, another field which is not really quite as much appreciated appreciated in the modern world is art. So art is important because you can't make things unless they look nice, and you can't sell them. So in order to commercialize things, they have to look nice. Recently, I was talking to the guy who manages $2 billion casino estate. And I told him, I'm an investor in ID Quantique. Any of you guys know about ID Quantique? It's a company in Geneva which makes quantum communication devices and classical communication devices which are encrypting data very strongly. And then they also make random number generators. And I was telling him, look, it's very important for casinos to have random number generators, because then you can sort of say that your generator is, it's quantum randomness. It's guaranteed to be random. And they say, yes, it's very important. So yes, I should talk to the company. But how does it look, this random number generator? And I've shown him on my phone, this is how it looks. He's like, no, it doesn't look nice. It has to look nice for me to be able to sell its quantumness, right? Well, next thing, it was important for me to be involved in sport. As for everybody, I was very sick when I was a kid. I spent about 6 months in the hospital. And then my mom, for health reasons, gave me to be trained in judo. So I've never became quite good in judo. And that's another way how I befriended your wonderful leader. As you guys may know, he participated in Moscow Olympics in 1980. That's how he was in Moscow for the first time. He also tells the story in the same way I would tell my story about judo. So I get some degrees in judo, but it was accidental. And he told me that, I don't know if it's a private information maybe, but I will still tell you, that supposedly there was a Polish judo team which was supposed to go to Moscow Olympics, and somebody got sick, and so he got on the team. And he didn't win any awards, but he participated in Olympics. So Artur is quite dangerous. I mean, he looks subtle, but don't attack him. And so same for me. I was doing it for health purposes for a very long time, and got some degrees, but not ever accomplished anything much. Also played soccer. Was very important. At some point when I started working extremely hard, and reality is that in order to succeed in anything, you need to work extremely hard. But in business, most of the time, if you are an entrepreneur, it's not just long hours, but it's also a lot of other things, like travel, like not sleeping many nights, like stress, like, where people think that you are an idiot or you've done something wrong or you will make a mistake, like drinking, like eating bad food, eating too much or eating too little, or not doing sports. And so since I'm 43 right now, many times I was told that the fact that I did sports a lot when I was a kid helped me to get that far, because otherwise I would probably be already much disabled, but I can still sort of function somehow. Then books. I was sick a lot when I was a kid, and I've read a lot of books because I just had nothing to do. And it's interesting, but again, another guy who I associate with the center indirectly, David Deutsch. Any of you read his books? Well, he's talking a lot about how it's important for human creativity to actually process natural language, right? So if you read, it's better than if you watch. Of course, maybe it's even better when you do something, but because I was sick at home and it was Soviet Union and I didn't have a TV, I had to read. And so I've read a lot of books, different books, all kinds of books about different people. This is all in Russian. How many of you speak Russian? Okay, well, there are some people. A lot of books which gave me sort of leadership lessons completely indirectly, because these books were primarily about leaders. So if you want to know how to lead the company, you should read a lot of books about leaders, about government leaders, about military leaders, about scientific leaders, about writers, about painters. The books never are actually accurate, but if you read a couple hundred, you will get some picture on how you should behave with your team. Most of business, and I think much of science, but not to that extent, is related to leading teams. And the best way is to learn by example. Unfortunately, you only have one life, so you can't really see too many examples in real life. good to read. Then another thing which actually break my head, and I think I'm still suffering. Just today I was giving interview to some reporter, and he asked me, where is your home? And this is one of the questions which I hate, because I don't know where is my home. So my girlfriend is my home. She's over there. But I mean, we travel all the time. We are in Singapore for 2 weeks, and we go to Moscow, and we go to Geneva, and we go to Zurich, and we go to Boston, and we go to Moscow, and we go to Novosibirsk, and we go back. Then, you know, within less than a month, I'm back to Singapore. And so that's what happened with me. I traveled all over Soviet Union. In Soviet Union, and I hope the world does not go back to Soviet Union quite as quickly. In Soviet Union, it was not possible for normal people to travel abroad. And so I didn't travel abroad, but I traveled all over Russia. And in fact, that got me to love Russia and like Russia much more than perhaps I should have. My parents, they happily moved to United States and the first opportunity, and they don't want to go back, and they're Americans, and they live between New Jersey and Miami. But I actually like Russia because I've seen all of it. Russia is not about Moscow. It's much more about space and nature. It's the largest country in the world. And I've been to all of those places before I was 15 years old for, you know, multiple weeks or multiple months at a time into geological expedition. This, for example, anybody knows where this is? Nobody knows. You should know. You don't know. Okay, this is the middle of Eurasia. If you cut Eurasia out of paper and you sort of put the finger under it, it will be Eurasia, the continent of Eurasia. It will be a middle of Eurasia. It's based in Kizil, in Tuva, ISSR. I'm not going to tell you much. It's actually the same time zone as here, just about. Then art, again, it is important to be exposed to art. I hated it when I was a kid. At some age, my mom decided that we have to go to every museum in St. Petersburg. And St. Petersburg is sort of like Paris, and probably even worse. In terms of number of smaller museums, there are about 80 significant museums in St. Petersburg and several hundred small ones. And so my mom, first of all, gave me to this Hermitage, which is again number 2 and number 3 in number of exhibits museum in the world. Russian czars pulled a lot of exhibits, and then Soviet Union post the war took every art they can take from Europe and brought it to Russia. And I was studying history of arts in this Hermitage once a week for 5 hours a week. And then I didn't like it, believe me. It sounds nice right now. I remember how I didn't like sports as well. How many of you did sports sort of semi-professionally? Not many. Okay. Well, I remember it was 4 times a week. And every time I would hope that the coach will be drunk, or there will be no light, or the bus will break on the way. And it would go on for 7 years. And so this was once a week, but it was kind of similar feeling. But not only, but we also went to all other museums. We became a professional guides because it was cheaper. And in Soviet Union, scientists were not paid much money. And so we became professional guides, and we needed to do certain number of tours. And then we get a free access to every museum. Again, I hate museums right now. One thing which sort of completely was wrong with all this bringing up is that I hate theaters, I hate museums, because I've been 2-3 times a week to a theater when I was a kid, and I was in museum 2-3 times a week for many hours, and so I really don't get it when people go to a museum for fun. And for me, it sounds like a professional work. Of course, another thing which was broken in my background, and recently I actually had a talk with one very wise guy who I tried to bring to be in sort of help in science. Paul Maritz, he was CEO of VMware. Any of you know VMware? Some of you must know VMware. And then before that, he was a sort of competitor of Parallels, perceived but not really. And then before that, he was one of the 3 people who sort of created Microsoft. He told me that it's very irrational to like science and to like art, and it's much more rational to like natural science. I also like to work, and since I was a little kid, my parents told me that apparently the best way of rest is to work. And so my mom, who was a sort of PI, would sign up to be a cook in an expedition every summer, and will go to different parts of Russia, and she will sign me up as a kid. And this was unusual in Soviet Union because kids were not allowed to work. One of the things you would read in every book in Soviet Union was that all over the world, capitalists, they exploit the kids' labor. And in Russia, it's not like that. But I was allowed to work, and I was a technician in geological parties. So I would carry in a bag and set up the tents and so on and so forth in all those places all over Russia. And then later, I guess I became an entrepreneur without actually understanding this at all. So I wasn't thinking much. So I was making this sort of statues, and my friend was selling them. In Soviet Union, there was no toys for kids. They were deficit. I don't know how many of you were born in countries like Soviet Union. It was quite a unique experience. And so I've self-taught myself how to make them in volume. So you'll buy one toy, and then you replicate it from different materials. And different complicated structures. And I would also make various equipment to sort of shoot different things, and fishing equipment, and this was all sold, and I will use money to buy some other stuff. Then I went to a good school. Actually, I wasn't ever planning to be a scientist. I was planning to be a neurosurgeon because I thought, and I still think, that one of the greatest mysteries for modern science is human brain, right? Nobody really knows how it operates and how creativity works. Since I was a little kid, I was thinking that if you are a neurosurgeon, you will understand how the brain operates. Of course, you wouldn't, right? You cut the head, and you just sort of, it's a skill to be a neurosurgeon. But my parents, because they were physicists, they convinced me that I need to go and study physics and mathematics. And they gave me to the specialized school in physics and mathematics. It was boarding school near St. Petersburg University. And at that point, I started, so that's a brain surgeon thing. I started to participate in Olympiads. And in Soviet Union, there was a lot of competitions and a lot of focus on science. Mathematics, physics, biology started winning those Olympiads. And so by the time I graduated, and I was only 3 years in a boarding school, I had no doubt that what I want to be is a physicist, because every Olympiad, and that's probably one of the best recruiting ways of my alma mater, was populated by people from the school, Fistech, and these people would sort of brainwash the poor kids that the best thing in the world was to study physics at Fistech. And even though I was from St. Petersburg, and this is sort of competing city with Moscow, I had no doubt I have to go to Fistech, and I have to go to the toughest faculty at Fistech, because otherwise it's not cool. And that's actually, at one point when I was already entering Fistech, there was some sort of warning sign that I'm not going to be a scientist. And perhaps I'm still sad about it, but the warning sign was that this was a Russian-made PC called DVK. You remember that? Good. And so on this PC, there was a test, which was run by 2 guys, me and my friend. We were both sort of in top 10 in physics Olympiads in Soviet Union at that time. And based on this test, they would suggest you a career. So one of those tests was several hundred questions. And he was suggested to be a scientist, and I was suggested to be administrator. And this was very, very offending to me, because in Soviet Union and in my sort of surrounding, being administrator was sort of like being a party leader and being a sort of bureaucrat. And look where I ended up, right? So those tests actually sometimes make some sense. Well, of course, then I went to Moscow Institute of Physics and Technology, and I think one of the most important things of this institute is people whom you meet. This is all the people I've got to meet in Fistech. Mr. Abramov is about $7 billion, $2 billion, most famous venture capitalist. IPG Photonics, some of you may know IPG Photonics, right? Also started by a graduate from our school. He went for PhD in our school. He's a multi-billionaire right now making lasers for all, who would imagine that you can make money this way. And then the other guys who are in technology, they're quite famous in Russia. All are multi-hundred million to $1 billion successful entrepreneurs in technology. And of course, these guys are, these are two of my classmates, Misha Lukin and Eugene Demler. They don't have Nobel Prizes. I still hope that they would get a Nobel Prize. They are quite highly cited. And of course, these two guys are Nobel Prize winners. They went to the same faculty as me, and one of them was working in the lab, which was just across the hall. Of course, I didn't really know him then, but just sort of knew of him. So it was great. And to be honest, for me, the Fistech was mostly about meeting people. Because with my background in trying to win international and Russian and Soviet physics Olympiads, I read all possible mathematics and physics books when I was still in school. And so I never went to any lectures. This guy was the son of another Nobel Prize winner, also associated with Fistech, Mr. Kapitsa. And never went to his lectures. He was head of physics department. I never went to his lectures or to his seminars. And this is another guy who wrote this book, Quantum Mechanics, Landau Lifshitz, but this is actually Mr. Pitayevsky who actually wrote it. And again, surprisingly, another famous person was teaching this course when I was at Fistech. Funny enough, a relative of Mr. Stalin, Mr. Aliluev. In any case, he was quite famous. Never went to his lectures or seminars. What I also needed to do is physical laboratories. I don't know if you do this in the US, but you have to sort of do different experiments. Of course you do. Well, always try to trick it and sort of write the results as, my teachers would expect. And yet I graduated with honors. In my school, it was probably only, let's say, less than 3% for people who graduated with honors. Because mostly I have a loud voice. As you can see, I can present confidently on some stupidest topics like my own bio. And to pass exams, you mostly need to be confident and convincing. If you're confident and convincing, most likely the poor lecturer or professor will rather prefer to give you an excellent mark and send you away. And so what I was mostly doing, I was having fun, playing soccer, and doing all kinds of other things. When I was actually presenting this first in Novosibirsk, they told me to remove some of the pictures because it's not pedagogical to give to students. I think it was for students which are just freshmen, that in order to be successful, you need to not go to lectures and seminars and just pass exams. It's not really good. But at the same time, I was involved in some good institute. This is Institutes of Theoretical and Experimental Physics, was still very operational at that time. There are several string theorists which come from there. I believe Mr. Polyakov was at some point there. Of course, this is Institute of Solid State Physics in Chernogolovka, still very functional. This guy was my scientific advisor. He's now head of the institute. And Mr. Gaim and Mr. Novoselov, Nobel Prize winners, they were working in that institute, in that specific building. And then the last thing I did, I actually got to be admitted to Landau Institute of Theoretical Physics, which was the coolest in Soviet Union at that time. But I never really studied there. I was just admitted to this guy, Mr. Zakharov. This picture here have a lot of significance to people in Novosibirsk. The guy is probably the most prominent physicist from Novosibirsk State University. He was more of a mathematician, but I forgot which prizes he won, but not the Nobel Prize, but close. Several prizes like this. And again, lots of sport, which was helpful later, and work, which was also helpful. Again, in Soviet Union, I was actually doing this in unique time, and the Chinese say that it's the worst time to be born in the time of changes. I'm not sure I agree. I think it's the best time to be born in the time of changes. And when I entered the school in 1988, Soviet Union was during so-called perestroika. But by the time I actually graduated, there was no Soviet Union anymore. And it was a difficult time. There was not enough supply of food. It's not like people were starving, but they were eating very, very shitty food. And there was not enough supply of anything. And so all students had to work very heavily to survive. And, you know, the prices were screwed up. And so we did all kinds of different things, like washed windows and installed the, the protection on windows. And we were also making roofs, and we were also actually doing all kinds of construction work. And, at that time, I remember, right in 1992, I started my business in 92, the first business. I was very sure I will never be a business person, because I was very heavily brainwashed by a Soviet system that being a business person is a very bad thing, that actually making money, it's exploiting other people. And so you have to make money with your own hands. And I remember that at that time I was honestly, convincingly telling to people that I will never, ever be involved in business. I don't have to. I will be a scientist, and if I need to make money, I can always go build something. Well, then I suddenly got married for the first time. And the first reaction of mine was that I need to be immediately transferred outside of collapsing Soviet Union. This is 92. I went and passed all exams. It was it's in Fistech, it's 6 years, 4 years for the bachelor, another 2 years for the master's degree. And I passed all the exams till the master's degree at the fourth year, and multiple courses, and entered Ladau Institute. And I was supposed to go to Turin, because there was some strong mathematical group, and Mr. Zakharov and Mr. Shabat was spending a lot of time there. My friends actually did go to places like MIT, like Harvard. There's two guys, Misha Lukin. Any of you know of Lukin? Okay. Eugene Demler? Okay. Well, anyways, Harvard is pretty cool from my standpoint. And so they did go, but then the summer hit. And in Soviet Union, just like now in Russia, just like probably now here, there was summer holidays, right? So you pass the exams, and July, August, you do nothing. And so I was married. For God's sakes, I was less than 20 years old. I'm not sure why I've done it, but so I decided I need to make money. And the first thing I started, it actually still exists, surprisingly. It's a school which prepares students to go to universities. In Soviet Union, every university had their own exam, and you have to pass probably 5, 6, 7 exams, say 2 maths, 2 physics, and multiple other exams to be admitted. And so we started the school. My friend asked me to do it. I wasn't actually even thinking about it as a business. We quickly did set up a centers in 19 schools around Moscow, hired from Fistech and from Moscow State University tutors, and tutored perhaps 1,000 students, made around $10,000. That was unbelievably huge amount of money at that time. But my partner, who is now professor in Heidelberg, I think, or maybe he's in Nazarbayev University in Kazakhstan, so he wasn't actually a business person, told me, this is my idea, and so you just help me to organize it. And so because of that, I'm only going to give you $500. And that seemed to be kind of not fair to me. And so I started looking for something else. And again, $500 was still a lot of money. The money rates were messed up, but perhaps it was about 15 times my monthly spend. And so I went on and signed up as a well, in any case, I signed up with one company to go and sell shoes and China-made coats to the middle of Siberia. They were paying me for the ticket and for the stay, and they gave me a bag of shoes and bag of coats, and then they paid me some, I don't know, $200 for a week. Then I also signed up to, and at that time in Soviet Union there was no yellow pages. So government had all access to the all information, and businesses did not advertise. And so yellow pages were just created, and they were selling themselves through multi-level marketing. So I also signed up to sell yellow pages. And then I also signed up to sell computers. And I went to some middle of Siberia, not far from Novosibirsk, to this Kemerovo city, which is a city with a lot of miners, with a lot of miners to sell all this stuff. And I went around to all these mine cities, and this was collapsing Soviet Union, so the miners, when there is no money, they drink a lot and they fight. That's just normal, because they have nothing to do, and they are drunk, and they are upset. And so I didn't sell much shoes or coats. I did sell some yellow pages, and then I did make a lot of contacts, and I sold some PCs. But I didn't even think about it as selling, so I was just trying to make a little bit of money. Then I came back, and for several months I was sitting in the office of the people for whom I sold computers, and was selling cigarettes and trains of food or trains of metal. Didn't sell anything at all, and didn't make any money on it. Then I got involved into first business. Apparently, all this time while I was doing all of that, selling all this strange stuff without thinking anything, and quite often what happens to me is that I get asked, like, okay, so how did you plan to start your business? Did you have a plan? I didn't even think it was business. My friend who owned the office where I was making calls from, he would ask me to do different things for him. Like he was selling computers. He would need to unload some truck of computers, or offload some truck of computers, or change some printers, or reassemble some computers. And this was based literally at my school. And I was playing soccer and doing martial arts, so I knew a lot of people, and I was also, having good marks. And so I would go to the hostel and just shout, and there would be a bunch of literally rocket scientists, PhDs in physics or mathematics, who would be there, who will come with me and will help to do all of this stuff. And so, at some point, the school year starts September 1st in Russia and in Soviet Union. And right around middle of October, I came back to this guy and said, like, okay, well, his name was Serguei as well. So Serguei, thank you very much. It was nice. I'm a scientist. I'm not going to be involved in business. I'm leaving. And he told me at that point, hold on. I've rented this, and this is all in my school sort of small city, in Vistech, small city, Dolgoprudny. I've rented the basement in a food store. And why don't you go and organize computer manufacturing there? What? Computer manufacturing? How do I organize it? He says, like, look, I'm going to pay you 3.5% from revenue and $3,500 a month, which was a lot of money at that time. And you can make you just work for me for, say, 3, 4, 5 months, and you just make, say, $15,000, $20,000, and you buy some nice things for your parents. And when you go to your beloved Turin, you have money. And again, I don't know how it is for you guys, but at that time, all of my friends, like, for example, Eugene Demler, and I'm sure the same happened to Mr. Novoselov and Mr. Gaim, when they would leave to go for postdoc or for master to their whatever schools, they would have real problem buying tickets and then sustaining the first several months. And so bringing 10,000 sounded like a great idea. And so I went on and I started to help to make computers. And I remember that my first conscious management decision was the following. I came in and I see the room with people sort of running around and the tables all over, and there are some computer boards on them, and they're assembling computers. And my first decision was like, look, this room, I need to put the tables across the walls, because then it will be much easier for them to access a warehouse and to bring their spare parts. And so in 3 months or 4 months, I did make the money. I bought a computer and a house for my parents, and then I bought a computer for myself. And I bought a motorbike for common use, and that's what I remember. And I came back to my partner, and again, I wasn't thinking I'm doing business. I was very much a scientist at that point. And he tells me, and I tell him, okay, now I'm done. You have a computer manufacturing. I've hired all these PhDs and masters to do this very advanced work of assembling PCs. How many of you assembled a PC once? Oh, significant number. Right, and so I can go. And I'm telling this to him, and he tells me, look, actually, you are a partner in this company. And so you will have 22% of the business. I will have 27% of the business, and we have other 4 partners together with us. And here is $42,000 cash, which is your part in the business, and that's where the money is, $42,500. And you also own a piece of the business. And I guess it was too much money, so I decided that I will stay for a little bit longer. And here I am, 22 years later, I'm still not back to science. The closest I'm back to science is talking to you. So then as it happens with early partnerships and with early marriages, I got divorced from my first partner, and I started my first business, which was on the surface a very boring business of making PCs and selling spare parts. And it's the bunch of stories behind it will be hard for you to understand. This was for Novosibirsk. They understood it better. But this was my first business. We ended up growing it to about $50 million and selling it in some years later. Just basically a replication of the business I was participating in starting, but I made it myself. Boring business brought me some strange branches of my business career later, because I tried to replicate it by opening similar business in Singapore and Sim Lim Square, and in Indonesia, and in Malaysia, and in Pakistan. And that was difficult for a while, and then we lost a little bit of money and closed it down. Well, again, that story will be difficult to tell, but just parts of it. It was very messy, and definitely I wasn't thinking very much. And so one thing, if you're thinking too much about starting the business, perhaps you shouldn't, because it's not about thinking. It's about just doing. But, for example, one story is that we were one of the first global distributors of, cyber helmets, cyber helmets. That's the same company which makes it. What's the current company which is the coolest, which was just bought by Google? Or was it Facebook? Oculus, right? So that company, we were actually exclusive distributor for Eastern Europe and Asia, eventually got resold in multiple places and somehow survived its IP and became Oculus. But we brought this first to Singapore, and this was our first encounter with Singapore government, because Gok Che Tong came to the conference, and Gok Che Tong was a prime minister, but he's a big guy. And this headset wouldn't fit into his head. And he eventually fitted it, but it was awkward for a little while, because he's a big guy. I don't know if you met him or seen him in person, but he kind of, And of course, we are Russians in Singapore, and the prime minister is in our booth, and he can't do what he wants. It's not nice. And then we were involved with Qualcomm very early. I remember meeting the original founder of Qualcomm, and we almost started a telco business in Russia at that time. But Qualcomm is, of course, now a very famous company, and at some point was even more successful than Intel, more valuable than Intel in PC manufacturing. Then we started another business, which was even more boring. So again, I had only master's degree in physics at that time, and so this business was manufacturing TVs. And it does sound boring, but it actually wasn't that boring. We actually literally hired several literally rocket scientists, people who were involved in Russian missile defense program, to build it, because we were building it without money and from scratch in completely destroyed remains of Soviet Union. So we were buying broken pieces of equipment for very low price and then figuring out how to fix them, making parts and designing parts for them, and then designing TVs. And in the midst, I was already spending a lot of time in Singapore. Again, it would be probably not as interesting, but it's definitely was a difficult business because in order to make money in hardware, and perhaps that experience is useful for me in helping some of you guys making money if you would do spin-offs, because most of your spin-offs will be about hardware. You need to own bill of material. That means that you need to design your device from the ground up. Because if you don't design the device from the ground up, you don't control the components prices and component supply, and you end up having low margin and not enough money to market your product or to hire people to sell your product, and so on and so forth. And that's perhaps one of the unique things about this unique company in Switzerland, ID Quantique, which is a tiny little company which is apparently successfully making money in making quantum random number generators, quantum instrumentation, and more importantly, quantum cryptographers, because they own most of their bill of materials. They design their devices from the ground up. And so that's where we needed the rocket scientists, because we needed to redesign color TV, audio equipment, video equipment, mobile phones, and washing machines. Unbelievably difficult to design washing machine. In order to make a washing machine and to make money, it's very complicated because you have to design it from minimal number of parts. So a lot of rocket science is needed if you start from scratch. Right. So then this was all sort of not technology business. And while doing it, I was spending a lot of time in Singapore and San Francisco. And my partner was spending a lot of time in Russia, and I was not really, originally the idea was that we would change places. So he would spend time in Russia, and I spend time in Singapore and San Francisco, and then we changed. But that never worked out. And so I was spending time here, and I was a primary shareholder and the CEO. I was very concerned about financial management. It doesn't sound innovative to you. I'm pretty sure all of you guys have bank accounts and write checks and receive bills. But in Soviet Union, there was no bills. And there was no bank accounts most of the time. Many people didn't have them, and there was no credit cards. And so accounting was very primitive in nature. And especially me, being not a business-educated person, was unusual to be trying to do accounting. And so what I did, I brought one of the rocket scientists to San Francisco, and he also graduated with honors from FISTech, and another one later, and I'll talk about this in a little bit. And they did the research about which accounting software packages this manufacturing company, Rosen, and computer assembling company and retail company, Falcon, can use. And we were amazed to find out that software is actually costing money. That apparently for us to have a proper accounting software for our business, we need to pay $100,000. In Soviet Union, software didn't cost money. And it was unclear to us, why would somebody pay for something which can be taken without money? And it was clear to us that though those accounting packages are quite complex, and so if we just steal them, of course we can hack them, it's not a problem. We'll have to continuously hack them and hack them and hack them all the time. And so that was a strange situation. And so we found a company based in Findlay, Ohio. That's the middle of nowhere in United States, which was called Solomon Software. And they had a wonderful reseller program, which allowed us for $495 to be trained and educated as resellers of Solomon Software product, and to also get the 2 licenses. One of them we can use as a demo license. Another one is to be used for our own accounting. So we did this. And first we tried to sell in Russia because we were completely ignorant. And you guys have to understand, this is 1995. In 95, I'm 23 or 24 years old. And I have no clue what I'm doing. Of course, we can't sell it in Russia because accounting standards in Russia are completely different. And then we started already trying to use it, that would be the right way to say it, for Rolson and Falcon and other businesses we were involved with. And then it doesn't really sell, and so we can be taken, our license can be taken away. So we needed to come up with something, and so I decided to try to sell it in Singapore. And of course, trying to sell it in Singapore was equally stupid. The fact that the software worked and the fact that it was popular in the US had, no relevance here. There was no presence of this company here. It was in US. But I've hired this guy, Dean Hanifa. He's Singaporean, half Indian, half Indonesian, pretty dangerous breed. And he actually told me, why don't we become not a reseller, but exclusive distributor? And I was thinking like, oh, why don't we become Solomon Asia? And we wrote a business plan. And since I'm a VC, I've looked at maybe several hundred business plans carefully. And we receive maybe 10,000 business plans between different funds. And I always bitch about badly written business plans. Just recently bitching about the business plan which this guy wrote. But that business plan which we wrote was completely horrific. Yet we sent it to this guy, John Howell, who was a co-founder of this business and was at that point leading all of the international operations, but at some point was a CEO. And he sort of replied and said like, okay, interesting, let's talk. And so I called him, and it's a story which he tells. I called him, and at that time my English was even worse than right now, but he told me, okay, so let's meet in person. And I'm in Singapore, and he's in Findlay, Ohio. In 30 hours in the morning, I actually walk into his office. And that's difficult because you have to fly Singapore, San Francisco, Singapore, Hong Kong, San Francisco, Cincinnati, Toledo, and then drive for 2.5 hours to get to Findlay. And he was apparently quite impressed with it, and he actually allowed us to be exclusive distributors, and which again cornered us because Dean still is involved with one of my companies today, and I like him, but he wasn't very successful selling. And so next year, I, who had no clue how to sell software, started to need to sell software, accounting software in Asia, hiring resellers in Singapore, in Malaysia, in Indonesia, in Thailand, and Philippines, and Laos, and Cambodia, in other crazy countries. And you have to appreciate how weird it was looking. I still was having a Soviet passport at that time, and I would go on into all these countries and try to convince them that my software is the best possible in the world. And the good thing is, it's to be ignorant, because if you are ignorant, you can honestly believe it's the best in the world. It wasn't, but it didn't matter. And so we ended up building this into a reasonable business in International Plaza. That's next point. Now, in about the same time, I was trying to sell software. And again, you have to understand, it's completely unconscious how this all happened. No plan, no relation to my education. I guess maybe some. I still was visiting my scientific friends, Eugene Demler, and he was a postdoc in Stanford University. And this was 1996. And you appreciate what happened in 96. I was visiting another friend of mine who was a postdoc in University of Urbana-Champaign. And again, it was 95, 96. And you have to appreciate that at that time he would go by some computer lab building and say, this is a building where Mosaic was built by Mark Andreessen. And I'm like, who is that? And what is Mosaic? And you know, why is it important? Why are you telling me this? And then I would visit my friend in Stanford, and the friend in Stanford would tell me stories with a despise about the bad people in Stanford. One of them was a good scientist, but then he started to be involved in security, actually financial securities. And then he left Stanford and founded a company, and he sold the company for several $100 million, and he bought a Ferrari, and he came back to Stanford, and people don't like him because he has a Ferrari, and it's really not cool to be having a Ferrari in Stanford. And you know, something really happens with people who go, and they would talk about it, and I would think, okay, a couple $100 million, security, good. And then there would be another guy who had a similar story, but he started a company in computer security and also sold it. It was one of those early days firewall companies. And so I was listening to all of that, but I wasn't really understanding what's happening. And so I thought what I need to do is to start a company in financial securities, right? So computer security software, financial securities, consulting. And I called several of my friends, and we started the company here. And the way we started it was that I called the guy who is currently running Acronis Engineering, and he was in Moscow. He also graduated from my school. And I told him, Stas, I want to do this computer security modeling software. And he told me, okay, I will agree to move to Singapore, and I will actually do this, but you have to promise that we use latest Microsoft technologies. And you know, this is 1996. Latest Microsoft technologies didn't work. But I had no clue, so I said, okay. And so we started building on latest Microsoft technologies in Singapore. And then there was a local guy in charge of development relations, Venki Char. He was originally from India, but he became Singapore at that point. And he realized that we are the second company in the world to license Visual Basic for applications. You know, Visual Basic for applications is part of Excel and so on. And then we're using Microsoft Transaction Server and DCOM, and we are using Microsoft Messaging Queue. You guys probably don't know those names. And so we're very advanced. And so he proposed that we formulate it into a business plan, and we apply for a Microsoft-funded grant program with NCB at that time, National Computer Board. And so we did, and NCB gave us a $500,000 grant. And you know, we never received the full grant, but we got a lot of attention from NCB, which is for current IDA, Infocom Development Authority, and from local Microsoft. And not only, but when Bill Gates came to Singapore, we were found to be one of the top software companies in Singapore. And we were about 1 year in building this company, this software, which we sold 3 copies of later, called Cassandra. It's very cool software, really. You know, lots of PhD and global PhD work was going into it, and we've shown it to Bill Gates, and this is my picture with Bill Gates. And imagine for me then, Bill Gates at that time already sort of in '97, the gods sort of came from, to the earth and meet me. And he not only, he said he spent about 25 minutes with us, or maybe 30, I don't remember. And he told us that Cassandra has a great architecture. And he gave us a quote for the press release. So we published a press release, Cassandra has a great architecture. And of course it had a great architecture because we used all of these Microsoft technologies before they actually started to work. And so there was no other idiots who would do that. And so then with that, we decided that we are the best engineering team in the world. We are in Singapore. We have the best architecture. And so we told Solomon, and Solomon software was in Ohio, was about $100 million company. Not huge, but it was in business for 20 years, right? And so they really knew how to write software. But we started convincing them aggressively that you guys have no clue how to build your software. Your software has bad architecture. And here we have a quote from Bill Gates that our software has a great architecture. And so at some point they had some internal thing and they believed us. And so from 97 to 99, we were building first part of their product line and then 95% of their product line. We created a team of about 65 engineers in Singapore, in International Plaza. We literally imported them from Russia in a variety of strange circumstances. It was a financial crisis both in Asia and in Russia at that time. So it wasn't particularly difficult to find good people. Very quickly, they were based on this database called Btrieve and Pervasive SQL, which is sort of former predecessor of MySQL. Kind of MySQL of the past, not open source MySQL. We convinced these companies that they have also very bad architecture. And so we started building it for them. And so by the end of 99, we had a number of companies which we were working with, we were working on a very unique model because we had Russian expatriate engineers in Singapore. That's very expensive, right? It's much more expensive than in India or in Philippines or in other places, in Russia, for example, or in Belarus or in Ukraine. And so we would design products for them, and then we will sell them cost basis our services, but then they will pay us license fee. And this were both, one was a $100 million company, one was a $50 million company. The bunch of other smaller clients, we had 4 or 3. And so this was working okay, but in 1999, it already became clear that there will be sort of an internet bubble. And the way it became clear is all those reasonable companies who had very reasonable business models, Solomon making accounting software, Pervasive SQL was making a good database software, very popular at that time. They decided that they need to be internet companies, and they started buying internet companies for huge valuations and doing some unreasonable things with them, and as such started to run out of money. And so in order to grow the business, we needed something else. And for a little while, I thought the good thing would be something which I call venture engineering. This is all pictures from that time. Before I go there, eventually we found a team, one Austrian person in US, one German person in US, and several of us, and they would find the money, and we would be the engineering team. And the company they were trying to create a company e-economy. Again, I wasn't thinking that much at that time, and so I didn't realize that they had no clue what they were planning to do. And this was sort of middle of 99, and we went on trying to raise money. And we first did it in Austin, Texas. One of these guys was from Pervasive Software, which was based in Austin, and that's why Austin, Texas. And I remember how we came up with valuation. And so you should remember it when you raise money for your startup. The Austrian guy said, like, well, I'm a very cool Austrian guy. I'm very established head of international sales and marketing, so I must be 1.5 million. And then the other guy said, like, I'm a very cool CTO. I'm from from Accenture. At that time it was called Anderson Consulting. And so I'm 1 million. And here is Serguei with his team, 5 people. So these guys are perhaps not so cool, but they're also another 1 million, as a herd. And so it's 3.5 million, and so we are raising 1.5 million for 30% of the business. And so we went on with this logic to VCs at the time of the hot internet bubble in Austin. And VCs were telling us 2 things. I first heard one thing and only then the other thing. The first thing was like, look, we are ready to give you money. You're right. You're cool Austrian, cool German, and a bunch of these people. Maybe not so cool, but they're also okay. And so 3.5 million is fine. And e-economy, we don't really understand what it is. But you guys don't have R&D in Austin. So your engineering is in Singapore. That's very far. And so I started telling them that, I will move to Austin. And that's how I went through only one successful real estate transaction in my life. And they would tell me, like, okay, if you're moving to Austin, are you looking for a house? We know a broker. And I said, like, okay, I'm looking for a house. And my wife then came to Austin, and she started looking for a house. And then on some meetings, they would tell me, like, okay, so you're looking for a house. Have you found the house? Well, have you made an offer? It's like, okay, yes, we found the house. So we found this house, and we made an offer. And the house was sold at like $959,000 or something like that. And we made a ridiculously low offer at a relatively hot market of $729,000. And in the United States, if you make an offer, it's a signed offer. If it's signed on another side, it's a contract. And so we would go, and I would show this offer literally to VCs, like, look, I'm moving. That's the offer. And in the meantime, the family which was selling the house were moving to Australia. And it needed to urgently move to Australia. And they would try to use all kinds of arguments on my wife, and I never even met them, why we should increase the price for the house. Because, it's a wonderful house. It's the next hill to Michael Dell. You can see Michael Dell house from there. It's a very, very beautiful estate. But we didn't care because we didn't want the house. And they needed to move to Australia. So they eventually signed the offer, and I had to buy the house. And we even owned it for a while. And later, when this first company collapsed, in a year, this family had some misunderstanding, and they needed to move back. In a very similar way, it's absolutely not a joke. They started calling. I was in Singapore at that time. My wife, and saying, like, you should sell the house to us because we have all the furniture. You guys didn't even buy the furniture for the house. And I said, like, okay, never mind, $919,000. Just it's cheaper than what they want. And they say, no, this is ridiculous. We bought the house just 1 year ago. The prices went down. In all kinds of arguments. And we didn't really want to sell the house because it was sort of nice, and was thinking maybe we need it. And eventually they bought it. and the rule, of course, is that it's always you always get the best deal when you buy something you don't need and sell something you don't want to sell. But the second thing this guy was saying, and that was the second thing which I was not realizing, is like, okay, fine, so you bought a house, that's great. And you do e-economy, and you're Austrian guy and a German guy, and so there's a bunch of people, and at least one of them is moving, so it's okay, better. But you need to do it in application service provider model, ASP. If you do it ASP, you're fine. And I started reading about ASP, and ASP is what is today known as cloud computing and cloud applications and cloud services. And at some point it was called software as a service. And at that time, it was a brand new concept. And stupidly enough, I decided that what I want to build is a complete infrastructure to help a company like Solomon to become an application service provider. And that's how we started as Wsoft. We drawn this picture in February of 2000, and I tried to first convince my German-Austrian partners to be partners in this, but they said, no, we are doing e-economy. And I liked them, and we're still friends, but they did not go very far. And what I really tried to do, that's a lot of stuff there, and I had no clue what I was writing. But it's sort of, if you combine, well, if you guys know software, Amazon Web Services and Force.com, and you not only make a service out of it, but you actually make it into an installable solution. And that's an extremely hard task. So it's impossible to get done. Nobody has done it yet. And that's what we tried to do, and that's how we ended up being as Wsoft and then Parallels and Acronis. We had initially a very good team here in Singapore and International Plaza in a very green office at that time. And we were building a bunch of products and dealing with a bunch of crazy people. But to try to make the story short, Right around 2000, we started building this. By the end of 2000, we started running out of money. And we had to split Acronis into separate company. And Acronis shipped its first product. Sorry for the pictures. This is my partners. They advertise this way. This Acronis OS selector. We actually shipped this product in Japan first. It was built in Singapore. And then we actually was still based in Singapore, and we were trying to very aggressively raise money. And of course, when you read the Singapore publicity, you would think it's very easy to raise money in Singapore. But it wasn't very easy to raise money in Singapore because there was not really venture firms in Singapore. We went to all of the firms. At that time, there was even less than it is right now, and they wouldn't give us money. And my partner and me owned very successful businesses, but he'd been very, very certain that software is a bad business, and we should stick with selling TVs. And he wouldn't give me money, So in 2001, I've tried to raise money in Silicon Valley, but by the time I made the business plans ready, and they were exactly horrible business plans, slightly better than the ones I built 5 years before that for Solomon, Southeast Asia, there was 9/11. And I'm sort of a victim of 9/11 because I was scheduled to meet VCs on the week of 9/11 and the following week and the week after. And I had meeting schedules and I had the business plans. And my flight was on the 12th of September to the Valley to meet VCs. And on the 11th of September, obviously all the flights were grounded. And so I waited on the bags. At that time in Moscow, we already had a small R&D in Moscow. 12, 13, 14, 15. I think 16 was Saturday. I decided to go play soccer. And I ran around some guy. He pushed me, and I hit the pole with my head. Had 14 stitches and pretty bad concussion. And so I had this, stuff on my head, right? And with this, when the flights opened on 9/17, I came to the Valley. And imagine Russian guy with long hair at that time, with this thing on his head, after 9/11 is trying to raise money for the business which is based in Singapore and Russia. So VCs first told me like, no, business is closed. There's no more business. We don't know what's going on. It's like war or something. That's it. Then, people recover pretty quickly. So on the next week, after this week of after 9/11, they said like, yeah, okay, well, maybe business is not so bad. Maybe we can give you money, but you are what's with your head? And why? So is it in Russia? Can you bring engineers here to the Valley, and so on and so forth? And so then at the end of that week, I took off the stitches, and so I started looking more normal. And so on the following week, the stupid VCs, and I guess right now I'm one of those stupid VCs, right? So don't listen to me that much. They will say, oh, okay, well, that's maybe interesting. You have a potentially nice business. You need to change this, change that, and you need to, hire maybe professional management team. But I ran out of time, and I had to go back. So I never raised money in 2001. And at that point, I had to move my R&D to Russia because it was much cheaper. One of the reasons of my success has always been the fact that I was actually born in Russia and did business globally. In 2001, you can hire high-end engineers in Russia for, say, $10,000 a year. And you can not only hire them for $10,000 a year, you can also delay their salaries by half a year. So you didn't need much funding. and so that's what we did. And, again, it's a long story. And I'm already keeping you for long, so I'm not going to go there that much. But eventually, after a number of complications, we ended up building a reasonably good company. Parallels today is doing these two things. One of them, as I mentioned, cloud service provider enablement. And if I look at my original vision of what I wanted to build in 2000 to what is available today, we are probably built only, 15-20% of what we wanted. But we still have about 50 million end users and 15 million SMB customers. And as a part of our solution, we accidentally needed to split one computer into multiple, and so we built a virtualization solution. First, it's container virtualization, and then hypervisor virtualization, and we were sort of first to realize that Intel-based Macs would actually need a virtualization solution, and so also rather accidentally we built a virtualization solution on the Mac, which some of you have heard, and the company is about 1,000 people right now and hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. I left the company in 2010, and at that time I thought that what I want to be doing investments, because I am such a good entrepreneur and because investments are very easy. And I started this 3 funds in this years. Runa Capital, which is IT fund, which is fund 1 was 135 million, about 40 companies invested, and fund 2 about 300 million. QWave Capital, which is a fund which invests in companies doing material science, such as ID Quantique, such as couple more, about 7 companies in the portfolio, and Fistech Ventures, which is a university seed fund, which just invests in early stages of any type of startups. And again, there is not that much time. I want to leave some time for questions, but now I look back at what happened between 2010 and 2013, and I couldn't stop noting that probably for me, investment is significantly less fun than building the business myself. And the idea which I had that investment is an active retirement, it was completely wrong. It's a lot of work to work with entrepreneurs and management teams and startups, and it's a sort of a very different type of stress. So if you have startup ideas, come to me. I will leave my cards. My email is very simple right now. It's sb@anyofmycompanies.com. One thing which we bring with all those companies, we bring expertise in building the business. And it's quite a unique expertise, I guess. There are several teams in the world who do that, but we were involved in building the business from ground up, different businesses in different countries, all over the world, hardware, software, and we did sales and marketing and channel management and operations and accounting and legal and intellectual property management, starting from doing it ourselves to teaching other people to do it, to hiring professional managers to do it for us. And that's what we hope to bring to places like CQT. Now, along the way, I was accidentally involved in building Russian Quantum Center, and I have to tell you the way it happened is also a complete accident. And of course, I love science, and I like reading about science, but the way it happened, it was like this because my companies were prominent in Russia, invisible. We had R&D in Russia, global companies, but R&D was mostly in Russia at that time. I was invited to various government places, and various government people, before all this political problem started, wanted to sort of integrate Russia into global world, and they were thinking about how to develop innovation and modernization in Russia, and how to make Russia look like Silicon Valley or Israel or Singapore. Different executives wanted different things, and they were saying, look, we have unlimited resources and we can help you. It will be very easy. Just give us some ideas. And Misha Lukin, who is a professor in Harvard and quite a good physicist, I think, was accidentally in Russia, and he invited me to drink vodka. I don't normally drink vodka, but Misha is one of those people who, I think scientists are divided into 2 categories. Some drink a lot of vodka and wine, and some drink none. And so he's in that first category. And so we were sort of drinking, and he told me, like, I told him, look, I know these government officials and you know, wealthy people, and they said, like, bring us ideas. And he said, no, in Russia, no, nothing will work. It's impossible. This is no, forget it. Let's drink some more. And and then later he came back to me and said, well, I have this idea. Why don't we start this Russian quantum center? This quantum centers are a very, very good thing. And there is one in Singapore. And there is, you know, centers all over the world. And he then introduced me to his postdoc, who then brought me here. And I've seen this center. And I ended up being involved in Russian quantum center. Of course, before that, if you look at my career, I was never involved in any kind of educational, scientific, or government administration, right? And of course, all of this about making it very simple was complete bullshit, because it was extremely complex and bureaucratic, and you know, probably generated almost as much stress as any of my businesses. But then subsequently, I was invited here and to Novosibirsk State University and to Innopolis University, which is built together with Carnegie Mellon, and eventually to my alma mater, where everywhere I'm trying to help science and education. You know, so I read this book. Who of you read this book? You should read this book. It's not really about science as much. It is much more about philosophy. And so good scientists like you guys despise this type of books. They think like, well, that's too much philosophical crap for me. But in reality, one of the major problems of science of the modern world is that it's not getting enough attention and enough funding to proceed with maximum speed. It can be solving a lot of world problems. And why is that? Because people in power, they prefer to buy Lionel Messi, or prefer to sponsor volleyball teams, or prefer to do whatever other crazy things like war, and not necessarily sponsor science. And why is that? Because there is not really clear understanding by the powerful people and the wealthy people of what is science and why science is important. And I think David loves multiverse explanation of quantum mechanics. Who of you guys like multiverse explanation of quantum mechanics? Oh, at least one guy does. But my friends from Fistech, because they read Landau Lifshitz, they despise it. They think it's like complete bullshit and, you know, totally unnecessary, and you just shut up and calculate. But besides that, he created a very good explanation why supporting science is important. And you know, in between this and this, I was active retiree, and I was having fun, and you know, I was having not fun, because raising money for science is very difficult, because it's not really investing, right? So the people's like, why do you invest in science? I don't invest in science. Nobody invests in science. Maybe governments can invest in science and receive results in 30 years. And that's good for governments. It's proven to be more profitable than investing in other places. But I was thinking that I'm sort of done being an entrepreneur. And I was actually literally driving to the airport to Moscow to get to London, and then to fly here to meet with Arthur and some of you guys in 2013. And I got a call from my partner. That's a guy who first did not like software businesses, and now he likes them quite a lot because they're much more valuable than any other businesses we build. And he asked me, where are you? And I'm like, why? And he's like, you know, one of us have to become CEO of Acronis. And it's either you or me. And where are you? And I'm like, I'm on the way to Domodedovo. He's like, oh, okay, so you're closer to Boston. So you should be the CEO. And so I was closer to Boston because I was sort of 40 minutes from the airport, and he was 1.5 hours. And that's how I came back to Acronis. And Acronis is a pretty simple business. It's backup, disaster recovery, and secure access. It allows you to not lose your data or not lose your system. So if you break your system, like Mac or PC, you can recover it very quickly. If you lose any data, you can recover it very quickly. And it's a multi-$100 million in revenue, 650 people, and so on and so forth. And I was told by my head of PR who forced me to have the stock here to mention that we just moved our international headquarters back to Singapore. Acronis surprisingly was actually founded in Singapore. I'm a Singapore citizen since 2001. And it might be one of the largest software companies which were founded in Singapore at this point. You guys are welcome to pick up free licenses to our latest release of Acronis TrueImage 2015, which allows to protect both Mac and PC. It is right there at the exit, right, Katya? Okay, well, these two girls, they will give it to you. We are releasing it today. And, lots of businesses use Acronis in Singapore. But more importantly, more than a third of our revenue is in Asia, and that's why we're moving headquarters to Asia. That would allow me to actually spend more time in Singapore and perhaps fulfill my commitment to Arthur to push you guys to make more applied research. So here in the audience, we had Ruslan, who is administrative director of Russian Quantum Center. And, you guys are lucky. You guys have very good funding. Singapore government perhaps is a bit bureaucratic, but it actually gives you a long-term funding, and it actually allows you to do science in more or less the way you want. In Russian Quantum Center, very quickly we hit the wall with trying to convince people that fundamental science is good. And so we sort of brainwash our scientists, and whenever they do fundamental science, they have to always think about applied results. And they have to always describe the market opportunities of what they do in a very clear terms. And in fact, we already have 11 spin-outs ideas from Russian Quantum Center. And Russian Quantum Center is technically only 2 years old, and Singapore is 5, right? So I hope there will be more spin-outs. Spin-outs are good. Think about spin-outs as entanglement with the real world, right? So it's good to do fundamental science, but sometimes if it's disjointed from the world, it stops losing sense. It's not really about money as much, and it's not about applied science. The true profit comes with fundamental science, like somebody trying to do laser or transistor. That one brings the most returns on investment. And we hope to see much more of it. Here, if you have ideas, come our way. That's it, and I'm ready to answer questions if there is any. Questions?
Thank you, Sergei. Go ahead.
Yeah, question on the entrepreneur journey. From between 2000 to 2010, you succeeded in your business, but that there's a whole thing that is blank. So how would you attribute to your success? Is it because you have great idea, you have a great team, or you're very good in selling your solutions? Or why do you think that you succeeded in software? A lot of people do software, they don't succeed.
Right. So I think fundamentally there are several things which are important to succeed. It's very difficult to try to provide some algorithm for success. Or, it's like a program. And so there are all these books, how to make $1 million or how to make $1 billion in software. They are all not true. But there are sort of patterns of success and anti-patterns of success. So, for example, the anti-pattern sort of thing you shouldn't do is to not be focused. So at some point you need to focus, and it's good when the world forces you to be focused. So for example, with us, we could have failed miserably if we continued on the original vision, but we had no money. And my partner, for all I know, did a bad thing, but also did a good thing. He forced me to focus because he wouldn't help me with money I could have pulled from Rolson and Falcon to fund my software business. And so because I focused and I split on focused parts, I was able to get some degree of success. But defocus is bad, so focus on one thing. Then the second thing, which is of course very important, you mentioned it, it's quite obvious, you have to have a good team. So it's a complicated thing because good team is not just good people, but it's the people who have good motivation, who work as a team together. And but still, most of the technology companies, whether it's a software companies or a material science companies, they only succeed at scale. And that means that you have to think of multi-dozen people, good teams, somewhere in the beginning. Well, the third thing, of course, it's very important to work very hard. That's, extremely important. People don't underestimate it. I deal with startups, dealt with startups on a sort of daily basis for the past many years. And many startups, especially recently, there was sort of a startup movement in the world, especially in internet services and in IT. And it was sort of thinking about startups as a fun. As go party and then go have fun and go do some startup and, travel somewhere and go for some competition. Reality is that I always give in my startup talks a representation of entrepreneur as in the movie called There Will Be Blood. Anybody seen this movie? That's a movie about oil entrepreneur from Texas. Entrepreneurship is very ugly. And entrepreneurs are typically setting their priorities: business, health, family. So the main priority is business. And this whole idea of life-work balance is not really present. There is no life-work balance. There is work, and that's it, at least in the beginning. So that's the next thing. And of course, you have to have good ideas because at the end of the day, we all depend on the opportunities. We can be very, very smart and very, very hardworking and have very good team and hit by the bus and not succeed, right? That's just a simple way of not having the right idea and not having the right luck. But in a nutshell, I tried to explain. I guess you have to have a broad enough view as well and understand what the products are. But I don't know precise answer. I succeeded because we never stopped. We just continued forward. More questions?
We've got time for one or two more questions.
One or two.
We're running a bit late. If not, perhaps people want to ask you, as is often the case, kind of in person at the end. So maybe if you could join me in thanking again, Sergei, for a really excellent talk. And thanks to all of you for being here.